If you're an Overwatch 2 player, you may see Brigitte as a sweet Swedish support who's done nothing wrong in life, but oh boy, would you be wrong. Not only was Brig the most hated Overwatch character at one point, but she even used to be so overpowered that she broke the entire game. You think Mauga was bad? Oh, you don't even want to know just how devastating Brig was. Except now you do, don't you? Well, worry not, as I've condensed my many hours of research into this short 15-minute video, so you can find out exactly how Brig broke Overwatch.
Rally to me!
Now, allow me to set the scene. It's early 2018 and Overwatch has been out for more than 1.5 years. Of course, with its diverse cast of heroes, several different metas have arisen and fallen, and the vast majority of characters have been strong at some point in their own right. However, throughout that time, one meta has been more prevalent than all the rest: Dive. This is a comp which focuses heavily on its high mobility, allowing heroes to quickly engage onto isolated targets, whilst also being capable of a speedy disengage if things go wrong. Since Overwatch's launch, many of these dive characters such as Winston, Tracer, D.Va and Genji have been consistently powerful, and over time they had become quite irritating. For the casual player base, Dive was frustrating with both how quickly you could die, as well as how difficult it was to retaliate against someone like Tracer. Meanwhile, the pro scene had been dominated by Dive for a long time, and although it could be fun to watch and play, people eventually grew tired of the repetitiveness. As a result, Blizzard realized that something had to be done about Dive's power, and so the daughter of a certain Swedish engineer was added to the game. When Brigitte was first announced in a February developer update, Jeff Kaplan, aka the former game director, pretty explicitly stated that Brig was designed to suppress dive.
Really great if you've got that annoying Tracer or Genji diving in on you and you use the shield bash, you're really going to disable them very quickly.
And suppress dive she could. On launch, Brig had all the same abilities she has now, although her stats and functionalities were significantly different at the time. To be fair, her Rocket Flail, Whip Shot and Inspire were similar, just with slightly different stats, but the other 4 components to her kit have been changed drastically over time. First off, she had a 600 HP shield. Nowadays, her huge ult shield only has 700, so just imagine having a 600 one at all times. On top of that, although the range was shorter, Shield Bash used to stun, through shields mind you, whilst being easier to hit and simultaneously having the same damage and short cooldown as today. Next, her rally was also significantly stronger, providing 150 armor to all teammates, and it never decayed away. Finally, Repair Pack may only have had 1 charge, but it instantly healed a whopping 150 health, and even gave armor to already healthy allies. This meant that if you ulted and repair packed, your Tracer could be running around with 225 armor on top of her base health. As you may already be able to tell, this kit was very strong. Oh, and I forgot to mention, she even had 250 HP when pretty much everyone else only had 200. So this is when she breaks the game, right? Well, not yet actually. Despite what you first think, Brig actually wasn't seen as all that powerful upon release. Of course, there were some who recognized her power, but aside from her clearly destroying Tracer, many people didn't quite realize the strength she possessed. They thought she seemed cool, but were more hesitant following a few previous weaker releases. At the time, Double Sniper was the meta in Ranked, and people assumed Brig would be easy to counter due to her lack of range. Of course, they would be wrong, but not immediately, as it would take 2 full seasons before Brig truly saw play. The Overwatch League wasn't much different. Although it was dominated by Dive rather than Double Sniper, Brigitte didn't have a huge impact except for nerfing Tracer. Brig was played, don't get me wrong, but her pick rate was still being dwarfed by both Zenyatta and Mercy in the support category. She would go on to receive 1 minor nerf in early May, but overall Brig seemed to be in a surprisingly healthy state overall. And most importantly, Dive was still popular, at least in the competitive scene. Here, however, is where our story begins to turn, as Brigitte slowly tightened her grasp on Overwatch. And it all started with GOATs. No, not those goats, this goat. What I'm talking about was at the time a relatively unknown semi-pro Overwatch team. It consisted of a few now recognizable names like Gator and Kaluge, but overall it wasn't anything crazy. In fact, in the future this team would largely fade back into irrelevancy, but not before they marked their spot in history. All thanks to the heroes they played. Most importantly, Goat's comp consisted of an unusual format, running 3 tanks and 3 supports. At the time, most people believed DPS to be imperative to being able to eliminate the enemy and thereby win games, but Goats disagreed. With a setup of Rein, Zarya, D.Va, Moira, Lucio and Brig, the Goats comp had insane survivability whilst also having heavy close range damage. It did lack range, but this was made up for by Lucio's speed boost, allowing the entire team to quickly close the distance and collapse on the enemy. The team was able to survive high burst damage due to the large health pools and massive AoE healing output, whilst also easily winning the war of attrition against any DPS heavy comps. Goats played super aggressively when the time was right, and were able to utilize the terrain to their advantage to prevent the enemy's escape, and once they were on top of you, you stood zero chance of survival. This became known as the Goats comp, and would come to dominate the meta for months on end. It's all built on Lucio's speed as well as Brig's ridiculous power in order to steamroll teams, and steamroll they did, as Goats used this comp to come out of nowhere and claim first place in the NA Open Division Season 2 tournament, as well as then crushing NRG in the Season 4 Beat Invitational. This was crazy, and it did begin to raise a few eyebrows, but since this was only a low tier team, the comp didn't gain traction immediately. It was used at some point towards the end of Overwatch League's first season, but was far from a serious option. Ghost still needed time to be recognized, and so wouldn't be played for the following months. That was until August 2018, where both Ana and Lucio received significant buffs, whereas the previously popular Mercy was nerfed. During this time, Brig did receive 2 more nerfs, but it wasn't enough to reduce her absurd 56% win rate. This encouraged people to start thinking about new team compositions, and slowly Goats began to emerge. It wouldn't be until November, however, that its true power would be realized, and Goats would come to dominate the meta. But this was only the beginning. At first, people actually didn't mind Goats. It was a refreshing mix-up from Double Sniper and Dive, which was now finally gone, and it allowed a new selection of heroes to be played. Even though some people disliked Brig when she first released, most people were over it at this point, and so didn't mind her being meta for a bit. Of course, not everyone liked it, as the comp could be quite oppressive when played correctly, but since most levels of the player base still didn't know how to do that, Goats wasn't too much of an issue. In most ranks, people didn't even want to play it a lot of the time, since DPS was so popular, and even in higher ranks, the team coordination wasn't good enough to make the comp quite as oppressive as it could be. In terms of competitive play, the Overwatch League was on hiatus, and teams and contenders did use it, but not as effectively as the comp's creators. And in terms of the experience for viewers, most people didn't even watch contenders, so it wasn't that big of an issue. By the way, this video took a lot of time to make, and in the future I'll be covering other heroes such as Widow, Mercy or Rein, so if you want to see more, I'd love it if you could like and subscribe in order to not miss future releases. Anyways, as the months dragged on and the comp didn't go away, problems began to arise. Primarily, Ghost was bad for a few reasons. First, and probably most importantly, it completely killed the DPS role. Ghost was so powerful that nobody died fast enough for DPS to be viable, since the DPS in return died far too quickly. I mean, in general, an entire role becoming obsolete is always a huge issue and should be avoided at all costs, but then this was made even worse by DPS being the most popular role in the game. I'm not quite sure, but my guess would be that this meant over half of the entire player base couldn't play not just their preferred hero, but their entire preferred role. On top of that, Ghost was even so oppressive that it basically forced a mirror matchup. Not only was it enough to obliterate DPS, but even a large chunk of tanks and supports weren't really viable. The only way to counter Ghost was to play Goats. And I know we complain nowadays about counterpicking, but no team composition as a whole should ever be so strong that you can never play anything else. This meant that Ghost was a problem for the casual player, as if they faced a Ghost comp, they would be at a significant disadvantage if they played anything else. And if their teammates refused to play it, and you thereby ended up losing, then that's even worse. Brig didn't help this, as she was incredibly difficult to take out, and could provide immense value as well as stuns with little skill necessary. But despite this, things were even worse for the players at the top of the game. Of course, for those who love to play one of the Ghost heroes it was fine, but otherwise they were in serious trouble. At least in low ranks you can still beat the enemy out with pure skill, but once you reach a certain point and everyone is at a certain level, you practically have no choice at all. In terms of top 500 players, GOATS dominated for a full 7 months with either Ana or Zen instead of Moira, and that is a long time to be locked into basically only a set of 7 heroes. Yet, where some of the problems truly arose was in the Overwatch League, with the beginning of Season 2, because here GOATS really took over. A simple switch from Moira to Zen in order to increase damage output, and the comp saw a whopping 70% pick rate. It was everywhere, and devastatingly, it was considered super boring to watch. Fights took too long, there were no flashy DPS plays, and ults got thrown all over the place, often for minimal value. This was made even worse by the fact that GOATS had already been meta in normal games for months before the season even began, and so when it was still meta in February of 2019, and it came up in every single game, you can see why this was an issue. The league averaged over 200,000 views at the time, and all of them ended up watching the same mirror match again and again. Sure, there were a few variations with Sombra or Winston for example, and a few teams even dared to play other heroes, but at this point most of them ended up unsuccessful. But hey, this has happened before. What matters is simply that the comp isn't as much of a problem later on in the season, so we can see some variation. But there was no variation. Or, well, very little at least. In stage 2 and 3 a few other heroes did see play, with Ana and Mercy getting more used as well as even a few DPS like Pharah, Widow and Sombra, but many of the core GOATS heroes, namely Lucio, Brig, D.Va and Zarya, were still overwhelmingly popular. To be fair, Shanghai Dragons did eventually manage to break through during the stage 3 playoffs, managing to win with some crazy triple DPS comps, but this was only once GOATS had been significantly weakened. Since her release, Brig had received 7 straight nerfs at this point, as well as all of the other GOATS heroes getting hit, and more importantly, Shanghai didn't accomplish this until July of 2019. This meant it had taken 14 months since the team GOATS had created the comp, and still over 8 months since the comp had started to dominate. That is way too long. And even then, GOATS was still very strong, and was the most played comp during said playoffs. Something had to change, that much was obvious, but Blizzard decided that nerfing Brig wasn't enough. They decided that the entire comp needed to be made not only obsolete, but physically impossible to play, introducing Roadlock. In August of 2019, alongside the release of Sigma, Blizzard finally took some serious action and changed the entire format of the game. Now teams would not only be forced to use a max of 2 heroes for each role, but players would even have to queue up for a specific role before each match. Easy to say, the community was very split over this. Some people were excited for the death of GOATS, other more casual players were ecstatic about the death of 5 DPS comps. But on the other hand, flexing roles mid-match was no longer a thing, 6-stack teams would be devastated, and casual DPS players were in shambles. And after a while, things wouldn't be quite as bad, but to begin with, the switch to Roadlock caused for some egregious queue times. Getting into a single match on any role was taking a long time, and on DPS it was taking eons. Looking back on it, Roadlock was definitely a good thing, and so in a way we can thank GOATS for that, although at the time I can see why there were so many complaints. Either way, Brigitte together with the GOATS comp had single-handedly broken Overwatch. Not only did it overtake the meta for almost a full year, but it was so bad that it even forced the entire game format to change due to a single problematic comp. Now, was this the only solution to GOATS? No, but clearly Blizzard were lost on how to get rid of it, and so something had to change. And Roadlock ended up being just that, and so finally there was peace at last. Of course, we all know how that peace was quickly disrupted by a certain duo, but at least the game had been saved from Brig. Now, in all fairness, she was still strong. Despite getting yet another overall nerf alongside Roadlock, she was still good in 2020. She was the second most picked support in the Overwatch League and saw nothing but nerfs for the rest of Overwatch 1. That is, except once, but that buff was quickly reverted. However, on the whole, she was nowhere near as oppressive, and Blizzard had finally managed to find her into a decent spot. Of course, many old players still hated her from her time during GOATS, but newer players no longer experienced that same resentment. And that is roughly where she stayed for the rest of Overwatch 1. I'm going to gloss over the rest of it here because although she remained quite strong, Brig didn't undergo much change until the release of Overwatch 2. So far in this video, I've been talking about how Brig broke Overwatch, but if you play the game today, you'll realize that she isn't nearly as much of a problem, and is in fact largely accepted within the community. So, how did this happen? How did she manage to go from a monster to a regular member of society? Well, aside from the obvious fact that Goats was now gone, Brig crucially received a big change to her shield bash, that being that it's no longer stunned. In their overall effort to reduce the amount of crowd control in the game, Blizzard decided to give Shield Bash a mini rework, allowing it to now do its original 50 damage, as well as travel further but no longer stunning the enemy. This was likely a huge part of why Brig is no longer annoying today, as the stun on Bash could be quite frustrating. But once that was no longer a problem, Brig settled in quite nicely to Overwatch 2. Since then, she's only received one truly significant change, being the mini rework to Rally in Season 4, and although some people overreacted to the huge shield and return of stun at first, in reality it didn't end up being an issue, and Brig remained relatively peaceful. On the whole, Blizzard seemed relatively happy with Brigitta's Overwatch 2 state. Of course, she has gotten some buffs and nerfs over time, as with all heroes, but she no longer feels overly oppressive while still being good when played right. Since the launch of Overwatch 2, Brig has had an overall low pick rate, being near the bottom of all supports, but not quite as low as someone like Torp. However, she still rocks a really high win rate, proving that she can be really powerful in the right situations if you know what you're doing. Simultaneously, she isn't as situational as Sim, for example, and overall I feel like she's in a decent spot. She's the type of hero to be generally better at higher ranks since she is really good at protecting her other support, whereas newer players may expect her to be as tanky as she used to be and end up dying in the front line. But being better when you know what you're doing is far from a bad thing, and from my experience, Brig has overall been fun to play and fun to play against for most of Overwatch 2. Well, now you know how Brig broke Overwatch and a little about how she managed to redeem herself. Sorry for not going super in depth for the second half of Brig's history, but I felt it was more important to focus on the main topic of the video. I don't know though, but anyways, I hope you enjoyed, and next why not learn about a hero who's been a bouncing nightmare throughout their entire existence rather than just during a certain period. Or you can check out one of my other hero histories. Either way, I'll see you next time.